If you train jujitsu long enough, injuries are going to happen. That's just the reality of training the art. I don't say this to scare you or to deter you away from training jujitsu, but too many students have this approach that whenever they're training, that if they do it just perfectly, or they don't push themselves hard enough, or if they avoid certain techniques, that no injuries are ever going to happen. And that's just not true or realistic expectation to go on to the mat thinking. Bumps and bruises, jammed fingers, and sore ribs are all part of the price of admission for training this amazing art. The real question is, how do we limit those catastrophic or the big injuries that could potentially set us back months or even years of jujitsu progress? And unfortunately, if we do hit those injuries, that can lead a lot of students to quitting altogether. We're going to go over a complete injury guide. What are the most common injuries? How do they most commonly happen? What can you do to try to avoid them? And worst case scenario, if you are injured, what can we do to hopefully return back to the mat sooner? So let's talk about the 5 most common injuries that tend to happen in jiu-jitsu. So number 1 is by far going to be knee injuries. And usually these knee injuries are like meniscus tears or MCLs or LCL sprains. They usually come from things like takedowns or leg entanglements or a extreme twist at a moment under pressure. Number 2 is going to be shoulder joints. So kimura's, Americanas, or just bad falls altogether. And this is often because the shoulder joint is one of the weakest joints in the whole human body. Number 3 is typically neck and back issues. And this one is huge, especially if you do too much potentially inverting, or you're letting yourself get stacked, or you're letting your spine kind of bend in a lot of ways, or you're getting guillotined a lot of times. Those things can definitely cause those issues to flare up a lot more. Number 4 is a lot of times something that students don't really think about as much are rib injuries. And this usually comes from when other people are putting some heavier top pressure on your abdomen or in your rib cage. A lot of times, unfortunately, you bigger guys will apply your weight to much smaller people, not on purpose to pop their ribs, but if the smaller person is not used to contracting their diaphragm, learning how to breathe through the different chambers of the stomach, then all of that pressure builds up, and that sudden instance causes a rib to pop out. And then number 5 is a lot of times fingers or wrist injuries. So this often will come from students over excessively grabbing the gi, most likely. They have been taught things like spider guard or de la Hiva guard, and they are using sleeve grips or collar grips, and they are big cloth grabbers, is what I call them, and they are hanging on for dear life. And that puts a lot of extra stress on the fingers. So you can have like finger separation. Your daily life already beats up your body, right? Your knees are going to ache from old sports injuries. Your shoulders are probably going to be tight from already lifting activities or years of bad posture. Your back's probably going to hurt if you're working a desk job all day. Even your fingers and wrist are probably going to be pretty sore if you do any kind of exhausted typing or manual labor or work. So these things are going to be the same areas that tend to get injured in jiu-jitsu as well. And you might be thinking, well, maybe I shouldn't train at all, or training jiu-jitsu isn't worth injuring those things. Well, the only way that you could not make those things even more worse is if you just stayed at home and you're wrapped in bubble wrap already and you never use them in general. But even that actually has a cost in itself, because if you're not going to use that joint, you're not building endurance-based strength and mobility in that joint. Some of the biggest benefits to jiu-jitsu is that you are moving multiple joints and you're strength testing them through other humans and training that aspect as well. It's really actually a tool to help you improve those things. You will pick up some bumps and some bruises, but if you train smart, you will also strengthen your body and develop mobility and build resistance in areas where people usually break down. So that's why learning how to protect these areas and paying attention to them while we're training jujitsu, and building some resilience in them is one of the most important things that you can do for the longevity of your jujitsu. So now that we've talked about the most common injuries that you need to watch out for and how they tend to happen, let's go over some kind of golden rules that you can tend to follow in jujitsu. Rule number one is to tap early and tap often. So the most serious types of injuries that we are trying to avoid are the catastrophic injuries. When you're first learning and training jujitsu, you should be very, very cautious and tap more on the early side than on the later side. Now, there are certain times where students can be what I call early tappers, where they tap too early instead of trying to work out of the submission or trying to work out of the position and build a little bit more confidence in that way, because that's part of deepening your skill set as a jiu-jitsu student. In the beginning, as you're trying to learn where you're most prone to those catastrophic injuries, what joints and what issues you have, you should definitely tap early and tap often. Another piece of advice that I tend to give students as well is after you tap, ask what is happening. If you get caught into a leg lock, for an example, well, tap if it feels uncomfortable or you're not sure which way to turn, and then say, hey, what are you attacking there? What's exactly going to happen? Because when you think of a submission like a heel hook, your heel is not actually the thing that's going to be broke. It's going to be your knee. If you are newer to jiu-jitsu, that's not really intuitive. That doesn't make common sense to most people. Or if you are attacking a Kimura, for example, well, it feels like your arm is locked into place, but what's actually going to hurt and explode is going to be your shoulder. You have to think about those kinds of things. So make sure you're asking and you're educating yourself about what submissions are causing what. So that way you can figure out how to avoid those big catastrophic injuries. They can happen on accident. What I mean by that is sometimes people do fall on somebody's leg on accident. It's not even due to a leg lock, but someone falls on it and their ACL goes out, or something severe happens, or a guy gets hit with a takedown and they land on their shoulder and it separates. Those accidents can happen, but usually those are more bumps and bruises that will tend to happen, not catastrophic injuries. Rule number two is choosing your training partners very wisely. So this one is huge because not all partners are the same in the sense of safety or where they can hurt you. So some are very safe and very controlled and technical. And one way that we can tend to judge this is a lot of times by their rank, not always, but that's a good way to do it. Whenever we're training with people, you're not going to feel like unsafe in certain things. And typically what I tell students is 80% of the injuries are caused by 20% of a specific training partner. So there's usually like 4 or 5 guys that are in every single gym, if you want to think about it, that tend to be the most prone to hurting people. But if you are more prone to certain injuries, then make sure you are choosing your training partners very wisely. So everyone needs to take accountability in that part, but making sure that you choose your training partners very wisely is a very important rule. Rule number 3 is have a baseline of training at a 60 to 70% intensity. That is a kind of default, right? We want to be more than 50% roughly, but I always don't want to go 100%. I'm not trying to win a gold medal. Now, I know there's some people out there that say you can't dictate what 60 to 70% feels like. And I understand that there is no perfect calculation, but most people could realistically reflect if they were going 100% or if they were going half. And then there are days that you might have to back it down. And then there are days that you might have to ramp it up depending on what you're trying to accomplish. When you train at a 60 to 70%, you're not putting too much stress on your body, and you might be able to train more days of the week than if you did 100% and now you have to train less days of the week. Typically, intensity and duration kind of go invert of one another. The more intense it is, the least amount of time that you can do that with. The less intense it is, the longer we can do something with. And this even goes to the idea of putting on submissions. I never typically want to hurt my training partner and put a submission on at 100%. Even if I'm holding gi grips or something like that, I personally don't like just holding on to gi grips for dear life. I don't want my fingers to be jacked up or beat up in a way. I've seen some jujitsu guys where their fingers are literally like crooked from side to side because of how much they've held on to gi grip. So hanging on at like 60 to 70%, if you feel like your grip is losing, then let it go. And then we can go into the gym and do like strength activities. In general, doing things at 60 to 70% is a very good default pace to try to build into your regular training. Rule number 4 is to do strength training and mobility training. And really, what this does is it acts like an insurance policy. Strength work builds durability in things like your knees, in your shoulders, and your back. And that mobility will help you improve your range of motion. So that way, if you are being stacked and you have put your body through that range of motion while under little resistance, then the chances of you being injured are less. Very important note here, it doesn't mean that it's zero. But if you regularly put yourself into these positions and you build strength, which we know, according to studies, improves range of motion, it's going to hopefully limit our chances of our bumps and bruises injuries. I'll tell you guys this, no matter how much you bench press, no matter how many shoulder presses you do, no matter how many squats you do, if someone has you in a fully locked in Kimura and they keep going and you don't tap, it will break. If you are in a full blown heel hook, no matter how many squats you do, your knee will break. Just because you strength train and you do mobility training doesn't mean that you're not going to be submittable. It just means that you're going to be able to have a little bit more endurance and durability. This could also help you maybe train more days of the week and increase your longevity. As a quick side note here, I will be teaching a live 6-week program that will be kicking off in the 1st of October. If that is something that you'll be interested in, I will explain more information about that toward the end of the video, but you can check out the pinned comment down in the description. So now that we've talked about some general golden rules that can apply to everyone and more mindset-based things, let's talk about some actual strategies that we can do while we're in the scrap of training that will really help you avoid those injuries. One of the biggest things that I like to coach students through is to control their own pace. So there's this mystical thing that starts to happen in jiu-jitsu that you feel like you need to match your training partner's pace. So if you're training with a young and a spazzy guy, you feel like you have to move just as fast. There may be times and moments for that, but in general, if you're very concerned about injuries or you're trying to limit them, you need to be in control of your own pace. And so that means at times you're going to be moving extremely slow like a tortoise while they are moving around like a hare. As you start to get more comfortable in jiu-jitsu and you start to learn more of the positions and you start to apply more techniques, you will find moments where you can speed up and then slow it back down, speed up and slow it back down. We can change pace in the middle of a round or a match. How you tend to roll over the course of 5 minutes is how you would do it. I remember back when I was a blue belt, because I was young and I didn't know much jiu-jitsu outside of being a blue belt, I would just use my athletic prowess, my speed, and pop from position to position and overwhelm, I guess, my training partner. Now I'm a much more slower style of approach, and there are places where I know I need to be fast and I can accelerate through because that's part of my game. But then there are other areas where I can slow down. So pace isn't just the same thing over 5 minutes. It's not slow for all 5 or fast for all 5. Now, number 2 is going to be more about slowing the pace down if you're needing to do that, is to be more defensive and build awareness. Typically, when you come from a defensive mindset, you're going to be more aware and notice when people are going for those submissions on you to avoid those catastrophic injuries. If you are just going slow and you're being more defensive mindset, you still might get submitted, but you'll be aware of where that bad spot is and where you need to start to tap is. Now, can you be overly defensive and just sit there like a shell and someone who's too tight? Absolutely, you can. And I don't think that's great for your jiu-jitsu development. But if you have a severe injury that you're trying to baby or one that you don't want to get any worse, then being more defensive is going to be the best way to go. Then as you get more comfortable, you feel a little bit safer in these positions and you can start exposing yourself and expanding what you do to open yourself up more. If you take more of a defensive and become more aware of what can happen to you, it's going to keep you much safer. The third thing that you can do is prioritize positional sparring over all out sparring. And I don't mean just from the knees or just from standing, right? Those are more scrambles and chaos that tends to happen. If there is a catastrophic injury, it normally comes from the scrambles and from those movements, in my opinion. What I mean is maybe you say, hey, can you start on top of me inside control so that way I can work out? Or hey, can you start on top of me in the mount? Or can I start on top of you? Or can we start in your close guard? But you are starting more in a position that limits those scrambles from happening. And this prevents those big accidental catastrophic injuries where someone shoots for a takedown and hyperextends your knee, or you get on your knees and your leg gets bent under you somewhat weird. Usually the lower we are to the ground in general, the less those falling kind of impact injuries tend to happen. Now, you still obviously have to be aware of the submissions and you're probably going to get tapped and you're probably going to get swept. If you're choosing your training partners very wisely, you know your body, you tap early, you tap often, then you can do more free-for-all training and play in those scrambled areas. Now, number 4 may not be some of y'all's favorite, but you need to rest. Taking frequent rest breaks is going to allow your body to recover. What most people don't understand is if a bad injury happens, that's going to keep you out for a couple of months and it's not a submission, not a catastrophic break, it's usually due to some kind of compounding effect. It's being injured over time. And then eventually there was something that happened that just kind of pushed it over the edge. This was happening kind of to my neck. Whenever I was a later blue belt and a purple belt, guillotines and darces and anacondas were really a big thing. And so everyone was going for front headlocks. Eventually one day it just kind of, I woke up and it was just, man, super sore and I could barely move it for like a couple of weeks. And it was an absolute nightmare. If I would have taken a little bit more of a break and read those signals and let them heal, then it probably wouldn't have got pushed to that point. But this can happen, especially if you already have some lingering issues. So you want to make sure that you're taking frequent rest breaks, right? You stick to your 2 times a week or 3 times a week schedule, or you don't roll every single round if you don't need to, but you're really making sure rest is very, very important. Now, if you remember back to the very beginning of the video, I said at some point, injuries are definitely going to happen. You've tried your best to tap early. You're choosing your training partners wisely. You're making sure you're controlling your own pace. You're doing all of these things that we talked about. There will be an injury. It's just inevitable in jiu-jitsu. And this is kind of the make or break point sometimes in students' career. They either get very skittish and very nervous whenever this happens, and they just quit training altogether, or they decide to say, okay, well, how can I work around this injury? Can I train with this injury? Or is it warrant that I take some complete time off, and how much? First thing I want to clarify here, disclaimer, I'm not a medical doctor. Okay, so at any time, if you feel like your injury is severe enough where you need to go to the doctor and the doctor tells you some advice, follow the doctor's advice. Don't say, well, this guy on YouTube said X, Y, and Z. I don't accept that responsibility. Make sure you follow your own doctor's medical advice. So there is a fine and delicate balance that you have to find whenever going through kind of this process. And so this is where I've created what I call the injury triangle for students to kind of think about. So at the peak of the triangle, at the very top here, is the pretty easy one. I would call this the severe injury. And the course of action with this is that you would want to stop completely. And this means you have experienced some of the really big stuff. There's a ligament tear. Your shoulder has dislocated. Your rib is maybe completely broken or popped out of place, so severe. There's no way that you could feasibly do a class, you could drill, you could practice solo movements. You absolutely have to sit out. Does this mean that your learning has to stop altogether? Absolutely not. Guess what? You can watch instructionals. You can watch YouTube videos. You could even go to class and audit the class and learn from a different perspective, from a spectator perspective, and watch how other people drill and watch them roll. Sometimes people say, well, I couldn't do that because it's going to make me too clammy and I just want to be out there so bad. Okay, I don't know what to tell you then. Get over it, I guess, because learning doesn't have to stop. Just because you're not physically on the mat doesn't mean that you can't learn also. But when it comes to the physical action, if that severity is bad, obviously we can't train all together, but we can still do some things off the mat to help us improve our jujitsu. Now, the second corner of this triangle is what we call manageable. Really, this is where I want you to live more or less with your injuries if possible. And this is where you can learn to train around it. Now, just like everything else in jujitsu, it's a skill. It's going to take some practice at learning how to train around certain injuries. In the beginning of your career, you may not know all of the positions or every submission that can happen, or quite how to roll with a specific sweep or roll over a shoulder in a way to protect yourself. I would really, really try to assess this injury and say, okay, is my jam finger so bad that I can't train? Is there a way that I can modify my game where my finger doesn't have to be impacted? And the answer is yeah. Don't grip. Use your legs, or just play defense. There's a lot of ways to train in the modalities that you don't have to go about your standard game. Any mat time is better than no mat time. When you're thinking about, should I take today off because I'm too injured? Well, you have to weigh that risk. Can I train around it? Just to be frank, there are some students that I have that are skilled, that are like purple belts, that they have one gear. And if they tell me that they're injured in a specific spot and I know they can't do this, then I'll say, you should probably take a couple of days off, because they have not developed the skill of training with that injury. And I'm worried that if they continue to train, then it's going to be worse and they're going to have to take those 2 or 3 or 4 months off, which is what we're trying to avoid. If you're wanting to train jiu-jitsu for 30 or 40 or 50 years, there are going to be times that you are having to train around an injury. So learning how to do that is going to be extremely important. And the easiest way is try to just avoid that joint from being grabbed or being tweaked. Communicate with your training partner. Hey man, my shoulder's injured. Can you not go for it today? My back kind of sucks today. Can I be on top and not play some guard? If you have what I call the Tin Man syndrome, where everything is hurt and you have no lube in your joints and you're squeaky and hingy all over, well, then you can't be asking everyone to do that. And you have to learn how to control yourself and make sure you're putting yourself in those positions, but make sure you're able to learn how to manage that injury while you're able to still train. Just do more drilling or do the positional sparring rounds and not as much free rounds. Maybe there's certain training partners who are too crazy that you don't want to train with whenever you have a slight injury. So this is where all of the things that we talked about earlier start to kind of come together. Now, the third corner of this triangle is what we call the gray area. The gray area is where you're not sure on any of it, right? It's not severe to where you have to take time off, where you absolutely couldn't train. And you're like, man, I maybe could train around it, but I'm not super confident in it. This is where I would definitely recommend outside opinion. Go to your doctor and get that advice. If you don't want to do that, maybe assess and test. So you could maybe go out there, do a light warm up, grab a training partner, say, hey, can I practice this, and see? And if it's just too painful, then don't train. At the end of the day, if you're not confident that you can train around it, don't train. But sometimes students are kind of pleasantly surprised that they might go out there and drill a move and do a little light roll, and they're like, that was not as bad as I thought. You might have to make some compromises. You might, and if everyone's going to roll 5 rounds, you might roll 2 rounds. Kind of how you should ease back into jiu-jitsu training as well, especially if you're coming off of that severe injury. You want to assess and test and see where it's at. Then we can eventually learn to train around it until we get back to that 100%. Now let's talk about the last big picture thing here, evolving your game. Everyone is about the short-term outcome. Everyone wants to become better faster. Everyone wants to get their next belt promotion faster. Everyone wants to do things now. What's going to help me be successful now? But if it doesn't create longevity, then what's the point? When you think about evolving your game, this is how you can protect yourself for a long time. I started training when I was 18 years old, and now I'm in my mid 30s. So I've been training for over 16, almost 17 years now. I know I'm not in my 60s, but I'll tell you, the way that I train now in my mid 30s is not the same as I was when I was 18. So my game actually has evolved and it has changed. The way that I pace myself has changed. The amount of rest days are much different. So I actually have done this advice that I'm giving you. I have evolved my jiu-jitsu game into something that is much different than it once was. And you might have to do the same too. When I'm in my mid 40s, I might have to change again. When I'm in my mid 50s, I might have to change again. And I can do one of two things. I can either complain and say, oh, well, then why would I learn to train jiu-jitsu? Why would I learn to do that if I'm just going to have to change and recover? I don't want to do that. I spent all this time learning. Then don't train or get over it and figure it out. If jiu-jitsu means so much to you and you want it to be such an important part of your life, I have no doubt that you'll figure it out. That's the beautiful thing about the art. It's a self-expression. And so I bet if you look at any painter, any sculptor, anyone who does any other kinds of art, what they did 20 years ago is not the same art that they're doing 20 years later. They evolve, they change. You see this all the time in music. Now, sometimes people will be like, I like the old music better than the new music. That's fine. Same thing me. Maybe I like my old jiu-jitsu versus my new jiu-jitsu, but it's what I have to do in order to keep this self-development tool in my life. Jiu-jitsu is more just about learning chokes and joint locks and everything else. It's about a way to stay physically fit, to have a community around me. So I'm doing everything I can to ensure that I'm safe and that I can continue to have it as part of my life as I continue to grow and develop in jiu-jitsu. I am teaching a 6-week live class that will happen at the beginning of October. Each week will be about building your very own jiu-jitsu game. I've broken this down into 5 core components. Each week, we will look at each one of these components in depth. You will work with me in this small group environment where we'll work on building your game. And then in week number 6, we will talk about how to put it all together, how we can continue to evolve it. The beautiful thing about building your jiu-jitsu game is it's a way that really limits you from being injured, because the more that you understand your game, the easier it is to train around it. If it's injured, you can modify it and you can learn how to continuously evolve it. Check out the pinned comment down below. That way you can get as much information as possible. Check out one of these 2 videos that are going to pop up right here, or one of these playlists that will pop up, and I'll see you guys in the next one.